So this is a head. It was a gift from one of my friends. And surprisingly, when I received it, the joke was not, we always thought you would get a head or something like that. No, my friend's comment was, this is a really good one because you can use it for distance as well as volume. And he's right. You can measure how many heads away something is. Or if you fill it up this way, you can find out how many heads worth of volume you have of something. So this episode is going to be about measurements. It's going to be about how we talk about measurements, how some of these measurements came together. And through that, we're actually going to be talking about something else. I'm not going to spill it till the end of the episode, but you might catch on as we go. And if you do, good job. If not, you'll be able to kind of parse it together at the end. It'll make perfect sense. So we are going to talk about measurements. We call this one, Dad, we're going to call it the measure of a man. Today on Weekly Dad News. Let's get ahead. Weekly Dad News. Ooh. So, measurements are super weird. They're super interesting. If you look at the history of them, they get kind of funky. And so we're going to look at the history of them. We're also going to talk about just how goofy the whole thing is, but how important it is that we have them. Let's start with the measure of one man, a guy named Oliver Smoot. Oliver Smoot in October 1958 laid down on a bridge in MIT, and his fraternity brothers at the school marked off his length. And then he moved again and they marked off his length. They did that across the whole bridge. About halfway through, Oliver Smoot got so tired that he stopped getting up and laying back down. So his fraternity brothers picked him up and laid him down, and picked him up and laid him down. And they were doing this to figure out how long the bridge was. They decided to use Smoot because he was the shortest, and they thought it'd be funnier that way. And so Oliver Smoot is 5'7", and the bridge itself ended up being 364.4 smoots plus or minus 1 ear, to show that they weren't really sure of the measurement of the bridge, but they were sure of the measurement of the Smoot. It's pretty fun because it's just taking an arbitrary thing and measuring another arbitrary thing with it. If you think about it, we do a lot of the same things with everything from feet to inches, and inches comes from the word that means 1/12. So you're literally just saying 1/12 of a foot is an inch. But then you start going, okay, well, whose foot? And 1/12 of what? And when you start doing that, you start to see how these standards were kind of wonky. You go way back, and Charlemagne kind of standardized stuff, but he was using stuff from the Romans. They had a thing called the le pied du roi, which is the foot of the king. What happens when the king changes? For whatever reason, right? So because of all this, they kind of shift up, and instead of doing something like the foot and the Smoot, they now have the metric standards. Let's talk about what a meter is now. A meter is equal to the length of the path traveled by light in a vacuum during a time interval of 1/299,792,458 of a second, where a second is defined by a hyperfine transition frequency of cesium. That's super specific. And the reason it's super specific and so abstract and not tied to a particular head or foot or anything is so that anybody that has the right tools can reproduce it anywhere. And if you're making a tape measure, you don't have to go find the person whose referent foot you need to use. You can then take that meter and you can transition it. So this switch from being kind of this ephemeral measure to a more concrete measure has to do with how confusing it was before that. I'm sure you've heard about how short Napoleon was. Well, the thing is, Napoleon wasn't that short. Napoleon, it looks like he was about 5'6½"-ish, kind of an average height for a Frenchman at the time. He did like to hire personal guard that were taller than him, so it made him look shorter. But one of the big reasons that he's recorded as being so short is that if you look in the records, it says he's 5'2". But 5'2" was in French measurements. they were based off a different foot than the English measurement that we use today and that England uses. So this gets caught up in translation across these two fighting cultures too, where Britain wanted to make him look dumb, like, he's so short. And France is like, well, he's 5'2", but that's 5'7" in Imperial units. So the other place this happens is in a meme that you'll see circulate sometimes. It talks about how horses' asses are the reason for the width of the solid rocket boosters. And the story, which is mostly not true, but partly true for reasons we'll discuss, goes like this. When they made Roman carriages and carts, they were pulled by 2 horses. So the reason the wheels were the width that they were is because they needed to fit 2 horses in front. And then you have these wheel widths. And then as you go down the years and you're transitioning into buggies and then trains and different kinds of conveyances, you're using the same materials and equipment to make them, and you already have roads with these ruts that are about, it's 4 foot, 8.5 inches is the distance between the 2 wheels. And so then when it comes time to build the train tracks, we build them at the same standard, 4 foot, 8.5 inches. The tunnels that they go through are carved to be a little bit wider than the train, so the train can get through. And that means when they make solid rocket boosters to take us into space and they transport them by train, they have to be able to fit through all those tunnels. So the reason that the solid rocket boosters are this width they are is because of 2 horses' asses. It's fun, but it's more of kind of a just so story. So looking at the history and kind of the standards, the 4 foot, 8.5 inches thing is just kind of about what they were. There were variations to those, there were changes to them. And then when we started making trains and kind of putting trains on tracks, the gauges were all over the place. Some of the standouts are Guatemala had a 3-foot track. So the width of the tracks was 3 feet. The largest one was the Great Western Railway, which was called the Brunel standard, and it was 7 foot and a quarter. So 7 foot and a quarter. You couldn't lay me and have me reach both sides of the track in between that. That's a really wide track. So they were all over the place. And not only that, but there were gauge wars. There were these competing companies in England where one company would lay one size and another would lay another. And they did that because they wanted to control the markets. And so they didn't want to be able to go, oh, well, we got it bought up and now all of our stuff works on theirs. They didn't want interoperability. It sounds a lot like the Windows, Mac, Linux kind of back and forth on interoperability and trying to control the market. You know, Apple Store, Google Play Store, all this stuff kind of is in the same thing. But those gauges on the different railways meant that you couldn't really have one kind of company making trains and another company kind of making and managing tracks and things. They were all doing all of the things. And the US and England were kind of sharing stuff back and forth, primarily in the North. So the North kind of goes, yeah, we agree with you, we'll buy your stuff, we'll work with you. And so the North, after these gauge wars are done, like, cool, we'll do 4 foot, 8.5 inches. In the South, they had 3 different gauges. The biggest one in the South was 5'6", right? So that's a pretty wide split there. After the Civil War, the North won. Well, obviously the North won, but some of the reasons the North won is the North had all cohesive tracks. So anybody's train could run on anybody's track. When you switch into wartime and you need to move troops and material around, it works great. The South couldn't do that because they kind of bump into these different sized tracks. It got to the point where when the North won and came down and said, okay, we're gonna standardize and bring all this stuff up, we've gotta have all 4 foot, 8.5, so that if we have another war, we can take care of it. We can also move your cotton better. So they come down, and in 1886, it took them 36 hours over 2 days, starting on May 31st. Tens of thousands of workers pulled the spikes from the western track and moved it to be 4 foot 9 inches apart. This is as close as they could get and still use all the stuff. But that means all of these train tracks all over the South were all converted all at once in less than 2 days. This is a pretty impressive undertaking. But that whole idea that 2 horses are the reason that the solid rocket boosters are the shape they are does not line up. It's more kind of a just so story. And the bigger reason that so much stuff is kind of that width is because it's a really convenient width. You can fit 2 people side by side. You can fit 2 horses side by side. You can get your cargo in the back. We don't necessarily need a much gianter thing. We just need about that much space. So it works for the trains, it's standardized, it's good, and now it's locked in. And we kind of all agree and all make trains on the same scope. It saves the ability to just kind of standardize it. So we didn't do that just with train tracks and gauges. We did that with all of our measurements. So we kind of did the same thing with the foot eventually. Like it's a standard one now, but we also did the same thing with the meter and the kilogram. The metric system at this point is called the SI, and that comes from the French, the Système International de Unités. I think that's right. We're going to go with that. And it's the modern form of the metric system. It's referred to as the International System of Units, or SI, because of the French pronunciation. It has the second, the meter, the kilogram, the ampere, the Kelvin, the mole, and the candela. And those are the core constants inside of, or those are the core measurements inside of it. And they come from 7 constants. Okay, hold on, these are weird, but I'm just gonna say them. We won't dive into them too much. You can Wikipedia them if you want, because they're kind of interesting, but it's also a lot. So there's 7 constants, and then everything else you derive from those constants. And this is what we were talking about earlier with the weird way you measure a meter with light moving in a vacuum and cesium vibrations. So one of them is speed of light in a vacuum. One of them is the hyperfine transition frequency of cesium. One of them is the Planck constant. Another is the elementary charge. We also have the Boltzmann constant, the Avogadro constant, Avogadro, not avocado, Avogadro constant, and luminous efficacy. So we have these numbers, and anybody can derive these numbers if they have the math and something to measure in ways to measure it, right? And all of those, you get a whole bunch of derived constants. You get these guys. These are just stuff that they took the other constants that we know and go, okay, well, this over this is this, and this times this is this. And you get a whole bunch of new stuff. You can make more. You can take these and derive anything you want from them, like Smoot. A Smoot is a constant. We know exactly how to derive it from these primaries. And once you have a system of deriving your measurements, all of a sudden it gets a lot easier. Because you know what they did before this? They kind of guessed. And the problem with that is that different people have different size feet. Different people have different size fingers and measurements and spans. A furlong, which was a measurement, is the distance an ox can furrow before it needs to be rested. What ox? What kind of soil? What time of the day? All of these things change whether or not the ox can do further or lesser of a furlong. And a furlong just means a furrowed length. It's how long they can furrow. So this metric system really kind of locks all this stuff up and makes it so that we're talking with a consistent dialect. This has benefits and this has drawbacks. It also has the scalability, which is great. So you get, in the metric system, you get deca, kilo, mega, giga, peta, which go up, and then deci, milli, nano, which go down. And you just change the scale with math, and it's scales of tens and thousands and hundreds, and just changing the number of zeros. It's a lot easier than going inch, 12 of those is a foot, 3 of those is a yard. That's a lot easier, it's just multiplying it. The biggest one they have right now is the Cuetta, which is 1,000 trillion, I think. It's a one with 30 zeros. I don't know what that is, but that's a Cuetta. So if you had I don't know what measurements it's used in, but that's the biggest one they decided in 2022. The smallest is a quecto. It's a decimal with 30 zeros and then your number. So that's now. Now we have this, but back in the day, everything relied on physical specimens. France said, this is baloney, let's fix it, and they had the meter convention, and then after that, they had what they called the meter treaty. And the meter treaty agreed on what a meter and a kilogram was, and then they had standardized weights that you took home with you. and you're like, this is my meter, and we have to keep it in this locked room so it's safe and nobody can change the meter. And this is our kilogram. And if we want to make a new thing to measure things, we go to the almighty kilogram. And it has this kind of almost reverential religiosity to it, right? Because it's fascinating, but it's just kind of, these are the magic stick and ball that tell us how long things are and how heavy they are. So this shift, like this change to having metrics, really comes out of all that garbage. And once you have that change to the measurements, you have a standard system. And once you derive better and more concrete pieces to that system, you get to have really cool stuff where you can not have to measure against the stick and the ball. The Americans, that's us, we haven't wanted to do the metric system because we're kind of grouchy and proud and don't want to change. But we did pass a law that said everybody can decide for themselves if they're going to use metric or imperial units. One of the problems with that, though, is that when we're sitting here using metric and imperial units, scientists are all in metric system, but a lot of lay people are still in, like, all construction. We don't do construction in meters, we do construction in feet. We do roadways by the mile. Speed limits, we have both, but that's not helpful. So when we have both, you have errors that happen. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel. They had been loaded with a pound weight instead of a kilogram weight. And since a pound is much less than a kilogram, about less than half, they ran out of fuel halfway to where they were going and had to glide into a landing. Nobody was injured, but that's a dumb mistake. And that happened. Probably the most expensive one is the Mars Climate Orbiter. We sent 2 ships out to Mars. One was going to land on the surface. The other one was going to relay its information back to Earth. And then after it did that, it was going to go around a couple of times. But when they were programming the software for the Mars Orbiter, they put in pound feet instead of Newton feet. These are force measurements. And so because they had a different measurement in there, when it was calibrating and using its propulsion systems, it was way off in the amount of thrust it needed to use. Its orbit decayed and it burned up in the atmosphere of Mars. That was a $125 million typo. I wonder if we know who did that. It's okay, we'll leave it alone. Because I think there were a couple of people that ended up having to make that mistake happen. Okay, so we know a little bit about measurement. We know a little bit about the structure of how it came to be, and we know a little bit about the history. But here's where I want to kind of highlight the change and the difference. So when you're communicating with people and talking through stuff, do you know what measurements they're using? And now I don't mean metric or imperial. Now what I mean is, how do they think about things? What are their standards and values for everything from morality to patriotism to religion? And what I'd encourage you to do is to try and step back and be more objective about the standards that they may be using and just think of them as a different system of measurement. Where if you're talking to somebody and they're from a different religion, or you're talking to somebody that's from a different party, don't judge them under your space. Don't judge them under your stuff. Try and think of the way that they're thinking about things as a different measuring system. You may be thinking entirely in imperial units, and they're thinking entirely in metric system. You may be both talking about feet, but you're talking about your own feet and the length that your feet are. Paces, walking, time. Time is a weird one. But all these things, when you're talking to somebody, it's a way to consider somebody else's opinion and viewpoint that should take the emotion out. Because when you have those one-on-one conversations, especially with somebody you're in a relationship with, somebody that's in your family, or even people you just work with, there can be a rise in an emotional response if they think differently than you do. Because it feels like they're trying to give you pounds instead of kilograms of fuel. Or it feels like they're going to be about 60 feet off and burn up in the Martian orbit. So take that and have the second conversation. What do you mean by this? How are you using that term? One that I like to use is, the story I'm telling myself is, and then reframe what they said. The story I'm telling myself is, we only need this much because we're weighing in pounds. Ah, I got it. I was measuring in stones the whole time. So try and take this stuff and abstract it out so that you can think more meta about your conversations, your relationship, and the way you view the world versus the way somebody else views the world. And I hope that'll help out. To wrap this up, we'll end with the measure of a man, because it's important to recognize that even though these measurements stay the same, sometimes the people don't. The people can change. Smoot went on to be the chairman of the American National Standards Institute for a while, and then president of the International Organization for Standardization. So this measurement guy, who is a measurement, helped lock in these measurements. And Smoot is no longer one Smoot tall. At 83, he's lost some of his stature. He's living in San Diego, and he is down 1.25 inches and stands at a proud 0.9813139 Smoot. That's our show for today. Thank you for watching. You can find out your Smoot height on the internet somewhere. I'll make a calculator. I don't know. I'll find something and put it in the comments. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.